Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander, episode 27, Keeping Up with the Ptolemies. It's been a while since we last touched base with the Ptolemies. In fact, the last time we mentioned them in any great detail was all the way back in episode 14. So, as the rivalry between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids is going to be something of a theme over the next few years, it's worth coming back to who the major players are in Egypt, and what's been going on over there while we've been focused on Antiochus I's problems. Now, a quick note before we begin about the immediate family of Ptolemy I. Ptolemy had a brother, Menelaus, who was appointed as commander of the forces sent to take Cyprus during the Third War of the Successors. I didn't explicitly mention him at the time, but he would have worked together with Seleucus to conquer the island during this war and Seleucus' exile back in episode 5. However, for obvious reasons, Ptolemy I's parents and siblings are not the main group we're going to focus on. Instead, his children and their descendants will be the dominant factor in our story to come. So, let's talk about them. As I've said before, Ptolemy had married at least 3 times and had at least 11 and possibly 12 children. The person who I'll get out of the way first is his mistress Thais. The only real story about her is a dubious one, whereby a palace at Persepolis was set alight at her instigation in 330 BCE during a banquet. Her children with Ptolemy were Leontiscus, Largus, named after Ptolemy's father, and Irene, although Edwin Bevan mused that perhaps the 2 boys were in fact the same person. Irene would go on to marry Eunostus, the king of Soli in Cyprus. In addition to these 3 by Thais, there is also one child Bevan mentions for who the mother is unknown, called Argaeus. Ptolemy I was married to the Persian noblewoman Artacama at the mass weddings of Susa at the instigation of Alexander. However, he rejected her as soon as he could, and they had no children. So, the first confirmed wife he had children with was Eurydice, the daughter of Antipater. They had 5 children together, one of whom, Ptolemy the Thunderbolt or Ptolemy Ceraunus, initially looked set to inherit his father's kingdom. Then, Ptolemy I remarried to Berenice I, and this marriage produced among others Ptolemy II, born in 308 BCE, and Arsinoe II, born by 315 BCE at the latest. Now, Berenice I is a bit of an enigmatic figure. Her parents may have been a man named Magas and a woman named Antigone, who was a daughter of Cassander and thus a niece of Antipater, the former regent of Alexander's empire. However, in his 1927 book, The House of Ptolemy, Edwin Bevan argued that Berenice must have been a relative nobody because her first husband, called Philip, was of low birth, and he cites the ancient historian Pausanias to back up his argument. He thus questioned how real the link to Antipater's family actually was. Her Encyclopaedia Britannica article supports this view, by stating that a family tree was made up for her which made her a half-sister of Ptolemy I to compensate for her lack of royal blood. So, again, the theme appears to be that there wasn't any royal blood there. Equally, Antigone's connection to Berenice I is mentioned by the scholiast on Theocritus, and it is still mentioned in some places. Anyway, Ptolemy may have met Berenice when she first came to Egypt as part of Eurydice's entourage, bringing with her the children from her first marriage to Philip. These children were Magas, who we'll mention in future episodes, Antigone, who would later become the Epirot queen, and Theoxena the Elder. Ptolemy was smitten and eventually married her, which Wikipedia places in 317, after the death of Philip a year before in 318, and which Edwin Bevan placed it by 316 at the latest. Now, we don't know if Ptolemy had actually divorced Eurydice at this time. The reason why this might be up for debate is that previous Macedonian kings had been polygamous, and in fact Alexander the Great himself seems to have had pretty few scruples about the concept of polygamy too. Later Ptolemaic kings would stick to having one consecutive legitimate wife, but their founder might not have done. So it's possible that Eurydice and Berenice were at one point simultaneously the wives of Ptolemy I. So, as I mentioned above, eventually there were two sons called Ptolemy. This might seem unusual given that the other successors named children after their own parents, Seleucus with his father Antiochus, Cassander with his father Antipater, and Demetrius with his father Antigonus. However, perhaps Ptolemy's own father Largus wasn't distinguished enough to merit such an honour. For comparison of what he would have been up against, Antiochus the Elder had been a general in Philip II's armies. By comparison to people such as Antiochus the Elder, Largus was a relative nobody. It is speculated that perhaps the name Largus was largely ignored as a consequence, with the exception of Ptolemy's possibly illegitimate son Bythaeus. Equally, there were other male names in the first few generations, as we'll see as we continue our story. So, Bevan speculated it may just have been coincidence, and by the time the dynasty became fully established, it was just expected that males of the family were going to be called Ptolemy. And let me tell you, unfortunately for my script writing abilities, there's going to be an awful lot of Ptolemies in the next few centuries. Anyway, Berenice seems to have been Ptolemy I's favourite wife, as Eurydice is found living in exile with her daughter Ptolemeus at Miletus in 286. In fact, it's here where Demetrius I Poliorcetes came to pick Ptolemeus up to marry her after his ousting from Macedon. This was despite the fact that the marriage alliance had been arranged about 13 years earlier. Incidentally, stick a pin in the name Miletus, it's going to come up again during the reign of Antiochus II. Anyway, I digress. The point is that Eurydice was no longer in Egypt in 286 BCE. It therefore seems that Ptolemy I may have intended for quite some time that Berenice's children would be the ones to be given the metaphorical keys to Egypt. Despite this apparent bumping down in the succession, Ptolemy the Thunderbolt remained in Egypt, still retaining that hope against hope that we sometimes all do that he would receive the crown of Egypt after all. And indeed, there were those who backed the Thunderbolt, who was the eldest legitimate son of Ptolemy I. Some would have preferred the grandson of Antipater, after all, to the son of Berenice on the throne. In particular, an Athenian refugee called Demetrius of Phalerum used his influence with King Ptolemy to argue the Thunderbolt's case. Whatever he said, though, it didn't work. Ptolemy I resisted, attached as he was to the memory of Berenice, who seems to have died by this point, and to her children. Eventually, on the 28th of March 284 BCE, Ptolemy II was proclaimed king alongside his father at Alexandria. The atmosphere in Egypt then became decidedly unhealthy for the Thunderbolt, so he fled, and the rest you know, with unfortunate consequences for the lifespan of Seleucus I. It seems that the spirit of cooperation was distinctly absent from the relationship of the two half-brothers, with obvious consequences for our narrative, as we've seen. In fact, an alternative telling I've seen is that the exit of Ptolemy the Thunderbolt from Egypt was actually the result of a fight for power in Egypt between the two half-brothers, which Ptolemy II won and saw his half-brother take flight in 287 BCE. Regardless, the overall picture for the Seleucid narrative is that Ptolemy the Thunderbolt was supplanted as heir by Ptolemy II, and the Thunderbolt ended up outside Egypt. Ptolemy II took full power around April to June of 282 BCE, with the death of his father Ptolemy I. There is one version of the story which claims that Ptolemy II murdered his father, but it is apparently more probable that Ptolemy I, who was after all in his 80s, died of natural causes. So it seems likely that Ptolemy I, in death, did the almost impossible among his generation. When Ptolemy II took sole power, he He transformed the cult of Alexander, which his father had begun, into an official Ptolemaic state cult, no doubt tying the legacy of what he would have claimed was his half-granduncle Alexander ever closer to the Ptolemaic dynasty. He also turned his father Ptolemy I and his mother Berenice I into gods, having them worshipped as the saviour gods. So, now that Ptolemy II is on the throne, let's talk about his own family. He married his first wife Arsinoe I, the daughter of Lysimachus, sometime between 289/288 and 281 BCE. The date is somewhat ambiguous, with the second source I've been using listing the range as between 284 and 281 BCE instead. This marriage is listed to have been part of an alliance specifically between Ptolemy II and Lysimachus against Seleucus I, which I assume means that Ptolemy II had some sort of agency in all this. To me, this implies that perhaps the later part of the time period seems logical, although that's just speculation based on the information I have available. The children of this marriage that we know about for definite were Ptolemy, later King Ptolemy III, Lysimachus, and Berenice. However, as we'll see, it is probable that there was an eldest fourth child, which we'll talk about in future episodes. A birth date averaging at approximately 280 BCE is given for Ptolemy III, while Berenice was born in about 275 BCE, and we don't know the birth date of Lysimachus. Ptolemy II also had one illegitimate son, Ptolemy Andromachu, with Blistiki, one of his many concubines. Ptolemy's legitimate children were the grandchildren of Lysimachus and Nicaea on their mother's side, making them the great-grandchildren of Antipater. This once again demonstrates that, although the male line dynasties of the Hellenistic world are thinning out, their descendants were still present in the Hellenistic world. This once again demonstrates that, although the male line dynasties of the Hellenistic world are thinning out, their descendants were still present. At this point, Arsinoe II arrived in Egypt, just after the coup by Ptolemy the Thunderbolt and the murder of two of her sons that we discussed in episode 23. The date range for this is, once again, varied. However, given that in episode 23 the coup seems to have happened canonically relatively soon after the death of Seleucus, the earlier range of dates starting at 279 BCE seems logical to me. Upon her arrival, she pretty much immediately started causing trouble. Queen Arsinoe I was soon accused of attempting to assassinate her husband Ptolemy II. This accusation was probably at the instigation of her loving sister-in-law Arsinoe II. King Ptolemy II therefore convicted his wife of plotting and rejected her in the 270s BCE, exiling her to Coptos in Upper Egypt. The king's niece, Theoxena the Younger, daughter of Theoxena the Elder and granddaughter of Berenice I and Philip, was also banished during this time, which might have been connected. As a brief aside, the descendants of Theoxena are going to come up again in the story further down the line. In 273 BCE, Ptolemy II married his sister Arsinoe II, before deifying both himself and his sister wife in 272 BCE, creating the cult of the sibling gods. The priest of the cult of Alexander the Great was also made the priest of the sibling gods. The priest of the cult of Alexander the Great was also made the priest of the sibling gods. So, if you've been wondering why I've been giving Arsinoe II a regnal name for the past few episodes, this is why. She now officially becomes Arsinoe II of Egypt in our eyes. Bevan notes that she may have had the intention to become queen almost as soon as she arrived back. He is of the opinion that, if this is so, removing Arsinoe I, as we discussed above, would have been no obstacle to her ambition. Let's take a moment to discuss this marriage of siblings. Ptolemy and Arsinoe were given the epithet Philadelphoi, or sibling lovers, specifically because of this event. So where Ptolemy I was Ptolemy Soter, Ptolemy II was Ptolemy Philadelphus. For pharaohs, and indeed for the gods of the ancient world, this would have been fairly normal. For example, think Zeus and Hera from a mythical perspective, and the marriage of Pharaoh Tutankhamun to his half-sister Ankhesenamun. However, to the Greeks, this marriage was abhorrent. The poet Sotades derided the marriage, and was exiled and killed as a result, thrown into the sea in a leaden coffin. By contrast, the poet Theocritus defended it, by pointing to the exact example of Zeus and Hera we mentioned above. After all, Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II were now gods as well, which meant that a marriage that would have been incestuous for humans would be permitted. So, it's fair to say that opinion was split. However, it does seem that the Ptolemies were explicitly linking themselves to both the gods and their pharaonic predecessors with this move. I should say that the marriage never produced any children, so we aren't sure if it was ever consummated. Arsinoe II's marriage and position would become a model which the Ptolemaic queens of later years would imitate. She acted alongside the king, becoming influential in her own right and seeming to be his equal in terms of titles. Furthermore, in his 1927 book, The House of Ptolemy, Bevan wrote that Arsinoe II seemed to be the one dictating foreign policy rather than her brother. There seems to have been a purge after she ascended to the position of queen. Argaeus, the brother of the king listed above, who I haven't seen mentioned anywhere other than Bevan's book, was killed on the charge of plotting against the throne, while a son of Eurydice was killed after being accused of causing trouble over in Cyprus. The three children of Ptolemy II by Arsinoe I may have been removed from the succession following the disgrace of their mother, and Ptolemy of Telmessus may have been adopted as the heir to Egypt instead. In this hypothesis, Telmessus would be made co-regent in 267 BCE, a year after Arsinoe II died. He would retain this position until he rebelled 8 years later. After this, he fell from favour and Ptolemy II re-legitimised his own children by having them adopted posthumously by Arsinoe II. However, this is not the only hypothesis about who the heir to Egypt was at this time. A rival hypothesis states that Ptolemy II and Arsinoe I actually had 4 children as opposed to 3, with an elder Ptolemy being born as the first son. It was this Ptolemy the Younger who then became co-king and heir, before rebelling and losing everything. However, as this is far too complicated to explore in detail here, I will go over the evidence for this hypothesis, and my own viewpoint on the subject in episode 36. For now, back to the Egyptian court. Arsinoe II seems to have been quite a scheming figure in her own right. After Ptolemy I declared Ptolemy II his heir, she had risen in prominence in the Lysimachine court of her husband. It is considered probable by the Encyclopaedia Britannica that both Lysimachus and Arsinoe would have benefited from the death of Lysimachus's heir Agathocles, whose own wife Lysandra was now lower in rank than Arsinoe, because he would have threatened the succession of Arsinoe's children with Lysimachus. However, stories claim that Agathocles' fate may only have been sealed after he rejected romantic overtures by his stepmother. Not to dig into the uncertain and murky events of the assassination again, but the point is that Arsinoe II seems to have been cunning and perfectly able to advance her own interests. After her death, all temples in Egypt were mandated by law to have a statue to her cult. A priesthood was established in Alexandria, which would lead a yearly procession in her memory. Her Wikipedia page says she was deified then, but I support the viewpoint that this must have happened before now, given its relevance to the marriage to her brother. Either way, she seems to have been popular in the country she came to rule. Arsinoe would become one of few personal names to make the transition from Greek to naturally Egyptian. So, with all of that court intrigue and politicking out of the way, let's touch upon Egypt's foreign policy before we finish. In 275 BCE, Ptolemy II invaded Nubia to the south and annexed the 12 northern miles of the territory between the first and second cataracts of the River Nile. This territory included an area rich in gold mines, where Ptolemy II would set up a mining town called Berenice Panchraisus. This gold production would be instrumental to Egypt's flourishing in the 200s BCE. However, as we've already discussed, it is war with the Seleucids that is going to dominate our narrative for the next good while. So, next time we will get into that conflict and explore the First Syrian War. Spoiler alert here, it is a long way from being the last. As always, thank you all for listening. For any questions or comments, feel free to get in touch at the show's email address. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.